At 30 below zero, the engine on a modern semi is legally not allowed to just sit there and idle to keep the cab warm. Some states ban it outright. Some fine a driver hundreds of dollars for running the engine more than a few minutes while parked. So the truck goes silent, and the driver is left in a metal box in a place where the air itself can hurt you, with a small diesel-fired box behind the seat as the only thing standing between them and real trouble. But that heater is also the reason this job has quietly become safer than it used to be. And understanding how it works tells you almost everything about what this life actually requires. This is how truckers get through nights at 30 below without idling, without a hookup, and without ever checking into a hotel. Here's what surprised me most digging into this. For decades, the only real option for a cold night was to leave the main engine running all night, burning diesel just to keep the cab livable. That's expensive, loud, and increasingly illegal. A growing number of states and cities now restrict idling to a handful of minutes at a time, with California banning it outright for anything over 5 minutes for most diesel trucks. New Jersey moved the same direction over a decade ago. So the industry had to solve a problem that sounds almost impossible on its face. Keep a person warm enough to survive extreme cold, overnight, without the one system that used to do that job automatically. The push behind these laws wasn't really about the drivers at all. Diesel exhaust from thousands of idling trucks adds up fast, especially clustered around truck stops, warehouses, and residential neighborhoods near major freight corridors, and regulators pointed to air quality and emissions as the reasoning. Drivers mostly understand the logic even when they resent the outcome, since nobody enjoys breathing that exhaust either. But it left the industry with a genuine engineering problem, one that had to be solved fast once the laws started actually getting enforced, instead of just sitting on the books. The answer that's become standard on newer trucks is something called an auxiliary power unit, usually just called an APU. It's a small separate engine mounted on the side of the truck, roughly the size of a suitcase, that can run heating, cooling, and basic electrical power without touching the main diesel engine at all. Picture it as a tiny generator bolted to a machine the size of a house, built for exactly one purpose: keeping a person alive in a box while the big engine gets to rest. It sips a fraction of the fuel a full engine idle would burn. And because it's specifically built for this job, most anti-idling laws exempt it entirely. There's a real cost to that convenience though, one that doesn't show up until a driver looks at the price tag. A quality APU installation can run somewhere around $10,000, sometimes more, which is a serious investment for an owner-operator paying out of their own pocket. Company drivers usually don't face that decision directly, since the trucking company either equips the fleet with them or doesn't. But independent drivers weigh that cost against years of fuel savings and fewer idling citations before deciding it's worth it. For some, it simply isn't in the budget yet, which pushes them toward the older, cheaper solution instead. Older trucks, or ones that never got the APU option, rely on something simpler. A diesel-fired bunk heater, sometimes the size of a car battery, wired to pull fuel straight from the truck's own tank and burn it in a small, sealed combustion chamber that radiates heat into the cab. No emissions inside the space, since the exhaust vents outside the same way a furnace vents outside a house. It's quiet enough that most drivers barely notice it running, just a low hum and the faint smell of diesel exhaust drifting past the cab on a still night. Here's the part that actually determines whether a driver sleeps warm or spends the night miserable. None of this equipment matters if the truck itself isn't set up to hold heat in the first place. Drivers layer insulation wherever they can, sometimes covering the windshield and side windows with reflective foam panels cut to size, because glass bleeds heat faster than almost anything else in the cab. Some stuff a rolled towel or foam strip along the bottom edge of the door, where cold air finds the smallest gap and pours through it all night. It's less about fighting the cold with raw heat output, and more about not losing the heat you've already made. Sleep itself happens in a berth about the size of a twin bed, and at 30 below, what a driver sleeps in matters as much as what's heating the cab. Sleeping bags rated for extreme cold, sometimes down to -20 or -40, are standard gear for anyone running winter routes regularly. Underneath that, an insulated pad because the floor of a parked truck in freezing weather pulls heat out of a sleeping body faster than the cold air above it does. Drivers who skip that step learn the hard way that the mattress alone does almost nothing against a metal floor that's been sitting in 30 below air for hours. Clothing choices matter more than most first-year drivers expect too. Layering loose, breathable fabric close to the skin traps warm air far more effectively than one thick, heavy layer. And drivers who sweat in their sleep from overdressing actually end up colder later in the night once that moisture cools against their skin. Wool socks over synthetic liners. A hat even indoors, since a surprising amount of body heat escapes through an uncovered head. None of this is complicated, but it's the kind of accumulated small knowledge that separates a driver who sleeps fine at 30 below from one who spends the night shivering and blames the equipment instead of the setup. And there's a genuine danger hiding inside all of this that doesn't get talked about nearly enough: carbon monoxide. Any combustion heater, whether it's a bunk heater, an APU, or a portable propane unit, some drivers still carry as backup, produces it, and in a sealed cab with poor ventilation, that gas can build to dangerous levels without any obvious warning. It's odorless, colorless. A driver can fall asleep feeling fine and simply not wake up. That's why properly installed systems vent outside the cab entirely, and why experienced drivers treat a carbon monoxide detector as non-negotiable safety gear, not an optional accessory. The forums where truckers actually swap advice on this are full of warnings about exactly that risk, usually from someone who either had a close call themselves or knew a driver who did. Cracking a window slightly, even in freezing weather, is another habit veteran drivers swear by purely for airflow. It sounds counterintuitive when the entire goal is keeping heat inside the cab, but a barely cracked window costs almost nothing in lost warmth while giving carbon monoxide somewhere to escape, instead of accumulating in a sealed space overnight. Drivers who've been doing this a long time treat that small compromise as non-negotiable, even on the coldest nights, because the alternative risk isn't worth the marginal extra warmth. So why not just get a hotel and skip all of this? Because the math almost never works. A single hotel room along a major freight corridor can run well over $100 a night, and drivers are often out for weeks at a stretch, running routes where the nearest hotel isn't anywhere close to where the truck needs to be parked. A parked commercial truck can't exactly pull into a hotel parking lot either, and truck stops with real parking capacity are frequently full by early evening, especially in winter when drivers are actively avoiding marginal roads and clustering at the same known safe locations. The truck is the hotel every single night because there usually isn't a real alternative sitting nearby. There's also a scheduling reality that pushes drivers towards staying with the truck rather than finding lodging. Time spent checking into a hotel, driving there, and driving back the next morning eats directly into a driver's limited legal hours behind the wheel, and for a job paid largely by the mile, that lost time has a real cost attached to it. Sleeping in the truck means the vehicle is exactly where it needs to be the moment the driver's mandatory rest period ends, ready to move without wasting a single hour of a schedule that's already tight. Truck stop electrification helps some drivers where it exists. Certain rest stops and truck stops have installed pedestal power hookups, essentially plug-in stations that let a driver run cab heat and basic electronics off grid power instead of diesel. It's the closest thing to a real hookup this industry has. But it's far from universal, and a driver planning a route through more remote stretches often can't count on finding one at all, which means the bunk heater or APU has to be reliable enough to handle the job alone, every single night without backup. We dig into stories like this every week, the ones where a simple daily need turns out to require this much engineering and discipline. If that sounds like your kind of thing, subscribe. There's also a legal wrinkle that catches new drivers off guard. Most anti-idling laws actually carve out an exception for genuine safety and health needs, meaning a driver stuck without a working APU or bunk heater in dangerously cold weather generally isn't going to get cited for keeping the engine running just enough to survive the night. But that exception depends on the specific state, the specific ordinance, and sometimes the mood of whoever happens to be enforcing it that night, so drivers don't treat it as a guarantee. They treat their heating equipment as something that has to work, not something they can idle their way around if it fails. Equipment failure is its own kind of quiet fear out here. A bunk heater that won't light on a night when the parking lot thermometer reads 30 below isn't an inconvenience. It's an emergency that has to be solved fast, usually alone, usually in the dark. Experienced drivers keep backup layers specifically for that scenario. Extra blankets stored separately from the everyday bedding. A propane camp heater as a last resort, used briefly and never left running unattended because of the same carbon monoxide risk that makes the built-in systems dangerous if they're not vented properly. Some drivers keep a battery-powered electric blanket as a final backup, something that draws almost no power and doesn't burn anything at all. Diesel itself becomes part of the challenge at these temperatures, separate from whatever's heating the cab. Fuel can start to gel below a certain point, turning thick and waxy in the lines instead of flowing the way it should. Most trucks running winter routes use a blended fuel or additive specifically designed to resist that. And drivers keep a close eye on their fuel gauge and engine behavior on the coldest nights, because a gelled fuel line doesn't just strand the truck, it can also take down whatever heating system depends on that same fuel supply. Batteries suffer in this cold too, in ways that catch some drivers off guard their first winter season. Extreme temperatures reduce a battery's effective capacity significantly, which matters enormously for anyone relying on a battery-powered APU or electric accessories to get through the night. Drivers who've learned this the hard way keep batteries topped off before a serious cold snap hits, rather than assuming they'll perform the same as they do in milder weather, because finding out a battery can't hold a full charge happens at exactly the worst possible moment, in the middle of a freezing night with no easy fix available. There's a rhythm experienced drivers develop for these nights that a new driver has to learn the hard way. Park early enough to grab a real spot instead of settling for whatever's left. Check the heater before it's actually needed, not after the cab has already started cooling. Keep water inside the cab instead of in an outside compartment, because it'll freeze solid by morning and otherwise. Small habits repeated so many times they stop feeling like effort and start feeling like muscle memory, the same way anyone develops a routine for a task they do often enough. Some of that knowledge gets passed along the same way trade knowledge always has, driver to driver, often over CB radio or in a truck stop diner during a stretch of bad weather. A newer driver learns which brand of bunk heater tends to fail in the cold and which one holds up. Which parking lots at a given truck stop catch the worst of the wind versus which one sits somewhat sheltered by the building itself. None of that lives in an owner's manual. It lives in the people who've already spent a winter or two getting it wrong and are trying to save the next driver that same trouble. And there's a strange kind of pride that comes with mastering all of it. Ask a veteran winter route driver about a night at 30 below and most of them won't describe it as suffering. They'll walk through their setup almost like a checklist. The heater, the insulation, the sleeping bag, the backup plan, because they've turned a genuinely dangerous situation into something they've methodically engineered their way through. It's less about toughing out the cold and more about having built a system reliable enough that the cold mostly just becomes background noise outside a well-sealed door. That pride shows up in small, almost competitive ways between drivers too, comparing notes on whose setup handled the last cold snap best, whose heater never once failed through an entire brutal January, whose insulation trick actually made a measurable difference. It's not vanity exactly. It's closer to the satisfaction any skilled tradesperson feels when a system they built with their own hands does exactly what it's supposed to do under real pressure, night after night, with nobody watching and nothing but their own preparations standing between them and the cold. That's really what separates a rough winter season from a dangerous one. Not raw endurance, but preparation, layered redundancy, and a habit of taking equipment failure seriously before it becomes an emergency instead of after. The driver who survives a genuinely brutal cold snap comfortably isn't the toughest one out there. They're the one who treated their heater, their insulation, and their backup plan as seriously as they treat the actual driving, because at 30 below, in a truck with the main engine legally silent, that preparation is the entire difference between a normal night and a dangerous one. There's another one on screen if you're not done yet.